and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. A lot has been going on this week alone, since last week. There's been a lot behind the scenes. This subject I've actually been sitting on for a while, a writing that was, a couple of weeks old, but didn't really forget it, put out on social media by somebody. And today is going to be kind of a counter to that and kind of an exploratory nature. There's some other things I'm going to get to at the end of my show that we're going to talk about, or at least I'm going to talk about some things that have been happening, some corrections that just need to be made, and an understanding. But we're going to get to all of that. Today, what I want to talk to you all about is power. And we talk about this all the time, talk about this in dynamics. But what I've been seeing, and this isn't just limited to one place, is that men are stepping into positions of power and trying to act it out. Relationships, leadership, day-to-day interactions, it shows up the same way. It's a tone in the way they speak or a kind of certainty that looks like control but isn't. But before I get into all of that, I'm going to do as I do every week. I want to say thank you to all of you who keep listening, who are sharing the show, who are writing your own articles, like the young woman who contacted me and wrote an article yesterday, right? You're reaching out about these conversations because they're important. They're providing some sort of understanding and they're helping in some small way. That's why I do this. And I read all of your messages. I read your notes. I do. And I appreciate them. That's why I keep doing this. So if you're new here, welcome. Right? I'm glad you found your way in. You're joining the rest of us. And if this show is useful to you, if this is my podcast here, do me a favor. Consider following or rating the show on Spotify, right? If you follow me on the app, hit that 5 stars. Why? That allows others to find these conversations as well. If you're following me on YouTube, like and subscribe, right? You're going to get notified when a new episode drops. And right now I'm dealing with the privacy issues. Every time I post a show, I've got to make it public like 10 times. I'm sorry, I don't control that. That's a YouTube thing. I am working through it. It's usually because of my titles of my show. And if you'd like to support the work directly, there is a link, right, that in the show's description that allows, any support that wants to come in to help these conversations keep going. Also, I've been notified my allergies are apparently in surround sound. I can't help that. I do apologize, right? Sometimes I'm going to sniff along the way, but I'm just human. So I appreciate it. I appreciate you letting me know. It's just sometimes I can't help it. All right, let's get back into it today. What I'm seeing is quite simple when I observe these patterns. Most men were never really taught what power actually requires, so what do? They copy what they think it looks like. They've seen versions of it, they hear how it sounds, how it's presented, and then they repeat it. Now, for a short time, that can pass, but the problem shows up when anything pushes back, when there's pressure, when something doesn't go their way. That's where it breaks, because there's nothing underneath to hold it in place. This isn't new, this concept, right? Men have been getting this wrong for a very long time. The difference now is that it's easier to see. More people are paying attention to it. They're reacting to it, calling it out. But most of those reactions don't separate what's actually happening. Everything gets grouped together. And then what happens is you lose the real understanding of the problem. So what I want to do today is keep this direct. Let's look at what's actually going on, strip out all of the noise and get clear on what power is, what it isn't, and why so many men fail, at it in the moment it's tested. So first, we're going to call this part it's the misdiagnosis, right? What I see happening here is when things start to get misread. People try to explain this by going on or pointing out something that's external. Culture, influence, ideas, whatever label gets used to make sense of it. That sounds convincing on the surface because it gives a clean reason and something to point at. But it misses entirely what's actually happening. This is not about masculinity being broken. It's not about men being shaped by some outside force or losing something they used to have. That framing is way too broad, and it avoids the more direct explanation. Most men were never taught what power actually requires. And there is a difference between exposure and training. A man can see power and hear it and watch it play out in different places and still not understand it, right? He can pick up the pieces, the tone, the language, the posture, how someone carries themselves, and he learns what it looks like from the outside, but that is not the same as knowing how it works on the inside. So, what fills the gap is imitation. And imitation is predictable. When someone does not understand the structure of something, they copy the surface. They repeat what they've seen because it's only reference point that they have. If it gets a response, if it works even once, that reinforces it. And now it feels like it's valid. The problem is that imitation, there's no real depth behind it. And it doesn't come from some sort of internal stability, it comes from observation. So it only holds as long as nothing challenges it. Once there, is a pressure on it, once something doesn't, go according to plan or expectation, it starts to crumble. Not because the person is intentionally doing something wrong, but because there's nothing underneath that can help them adapt. So this is where ego comes in. Now, ego in this context is not arrogance for the sake of it. It's compensation. It is what shows up when someone needs to maintain the image of control without actually having control. So instead of adjusting, instead of maybe slowing down and taking in what's going on, they double down on the role. They become rigid or they rely more on the appearance of authority because they don't have the internal structure to hold it. That is where things start to shift from ineffective to unstable. Power is not defined by how someone acts when things are going well. It's defined by how they respond when something doesn't align, when they're challenged, when there's friction, right? And I have a really good example I'm going to get to later, right? Without structure, there's no flexibility. And without training, there's no reference point for how to handle those moments. The responses become reactive, and with reactivity is what people are actually seeing, even if they're not naming it in that way. This is not men being shaped into something new. This is men stepping into something they were never really shown how to carry. So they fall back on what's available, which is imitation reinforced by ego. And it only holds as long as nothing is tested. That's the part that keeps getting overlooked because it's easier to assign it as something broad or external than to recognize how often this comes down to a lack of structure at the individual level. Now, until that's understood, the response to it just stays surface level as the behavior itself. And this is where we come to the most, the next part of this. Stop collapsing everything into one category, because this is where the conversation starts to lose precision, because everything just gets lumped together, right? When people see the behavior and they don't like it, or the behavior feels off, it all gets labeled the same way. There's no distinction between someone who doesn't know what they're doing or someone who's compensating for something internally and someone who's actually acting with harmful intent. It all just gets grouped together. And once that happens, the responses become just as blunt as the label. But these are not the same thing. So, inexperience here, for example, is the first category and definitely the most common. This is someone who does not understand what they're stepping into. They haven't seen it, at the extent where they're educating on it or practicing it in nature, right? So they have an idea of it, but they haven't been ever taught how to carry it properly. So they make mistakes or they misread a situation or overstep without realizing it, not because they're not trying to take something from someone, but because they don't yet understand the structure they're in or how that operates. That requires correction. It requires feedback and boundaries and time. It's a learning problem, right? Now, ego driven behavior is different. This is where someone is trying to maintain the image of control because, they don't have the stable internal sense of it. So they rely on things that look right instead of how they function. They push where they should pause. They resist feedback because it threatens the role they're trying to hold. And they need to feel control, so they act in ways that reinforce that feeling, even when it creates problems. That requires confrontation. It requires pressure, because without it, the behavior doesn't change. It's not a lack of information, it's a lack of internal stability. Then there's actual harmful intent. Now, this is where someone is knowingly disregarding boundaries, manipulating, or taking advantage of another person. And they understand enough to know that they're doing it, right? But guess what? They continue anyway. And this is not confusion. This is not insecurity. It is a choice to do this. And that requires removal. It requires distance and clear consequences, because there's no adjustment happening on the inside of it. So when you collapse all three of these into, one big category, you create confusion. You end up responding to an experience as if it's harm. You miss the actual harm because it gets buried under everything else. And then you reinforce ego-driven behavior by reacting to it without understanding what's driving it. And this is where overcorrecting starts to show up. Everything becomes extreme. Every mistake is treated as intent. Every misstep is treated as some sort of violation. And once that happens, people either shut down or they stop listening entirely, because the response no longer matches the behavior. Different problems require different responses. So if you treat everything the same, nothing gets addressed properly. You're not going to teach someone, you know, especially if they're the person who needs to learn. You don't challenge the person who needs to be confronted. And you don't remove the person who's actually, causing the harm. You're just creating noise. And in that noise, the original issue doesn't get clearer, it gets harder to see. So if you want to understand what's actually happening, you have to separate these things. You have to look at the behavior for what it is, not what it feels like in the moment, and then respond to that. So let's understand why. Let's get into the area that I know, the area that I understand, the theories, and what not just I'm going to say, but what stats and research says, right? Because somebody asked me, if you're going to talk about this, you're going to bring up all this information. I can. The reason why I don't tend to speak heavy into psychology is because it sounds academic, and I don't like that. I didn't like it when I was in school. I don't connect to people that way. I connect on a different level with the theory behind it, but that's a different story. So let's talk about this, all right? This is where we have to stop looking at the behavior and start looking at what's driving it. Because on the surface, everything looks similar. Tone, posture, how someone carries themselves, it all can pass for confidence or control if you don't look any deeper. But what sits underneath is what determines whether it holds or it falls apart. Now, a lot of men tie identity to control instead of internal stability. Control becomes the reference point for how they experience themselves. If things are going their way, if they feel like they're, directing what is happening, they feel solid. The moment that shifts, the moment something doesn't align, something inside shifts with it. That's not power, that's dependence on the environment to feel stable. I'll give you some examples. First, control is being used as a substitute for internal regulation. When someone has internal stability, they can sit in uncertainty without needing to immediately change it. They can take information or adjust and respond and stay consistent in how they carry themselves, right? When that stability is not there, control becomes the tool to create it. They try to shape the situation, the interaction, or the other person so they don't have to deal with what's happening on the inside. That is where the fragile sense of self shows up. And guess what? It doesn't always look obvious. It's not going to, it doesn't look weak. And in a lot of these cases, it looks like certainty, might even look like direction. Someone who knows what they're doing. But that certainty is conditional, and it depends on things staying within a certain range. And the moment that, anything pushes outside of that range, or there's a disagreement, anything that's unexpected, that certainty starts to tighten. So what happens? Compliance becomes reassurance. If the other person you're with is aligned, if they're following or agreeing or responding in a way that fits the expectation, everything feels stable. So the moment that changes, the reaction follows, not because the situation itself is the problem, but because the internal state is now unstable. So what you are seeing is not a response to the moment, it's a response to the loss of that reinforcement. And this is where dominance gets confused with validation. So instead of being something that is held internally and expressed outwardly, it becomes something that needs to be confirmed by another person. The behavior shifts from function to feedback. Am I being followed, respected? Am I being seen a certain way? The once that shift happens, the focus is no longer on what's actually going on in that interaction. It's on maintaining the image of control. Now, not all of this shows up, as overt control. Some men move in the opposite direction and manage perception instead. And you'll see this in virtue signaling, in white knighting, putting other men down to position themselves as safe or different or aligned. The mechanism is the same. Identity is still tied to an external response. Approval replaces control, but the dependency is identical. Okay? This leads us to dominance turns into dependency. Now, dependency doesn't hold up under pressure. This is where reactivity becomes clear. When there is no internal regulation, there's no space between what happens and how someone responds. Everything becomes immediate, right? So there's going to be a tonal shift. Their behavior will tighten up. Everything around them becomes immediate, right? All of these things, rigidity. Some might become more forceful, or they might withdraw. It can present itself as frustration, defensiveness, even escalation. But all of this, the pattern remains the same. There's no capacity to absorb the moment. Now, research consistently shows that controlling behavior is often linked to underlying insecurity and a need to manage uncertainty. When someone doesn't feel stable internally, they try to reduce unpredictability by controlling all of their external variables. That can be, the situation, I don't know, the conversation, the other person, the rooms that they're in, the things that they do, right? It creates a short term sense of order, but it doesn't build anything that becomes sustainable. Not because the situation requires it, but because the internal system can't regulate the disruption. The more someone relies on control to feel stable, the more intense the reaction becomes when that control is threatened. That is why what starts as subtle control can shift into something much more rigid or aggressive over time. This is the sequence that keeps repeating. Control here becomes identity. Identity depends on external response. External response shifts. Guess what? Your system reacts. And most people only ever see the reaction, they don't see what's driving it. So when this gets explained as attitude or personality or influence, it misses the point. It's not about someone choosing to act a certain way because what they have, has been exposed to. This is about someone trying to stabilize themselves using control because then they don't have, they have no other way to really do it. That's why this matters. If a man cannot regulate himself, he's going to try to regulate others. Everything else you see builds on top of that. So, what does power actually require? If we break this down, right, the question becomes what actually holds? Power is not something you declare, it's not something you take, it's something that shows up in how you behave over time, especially when nothing is going your way. If there's no structure behind it, it's always going to collapse under pressure. And that's the difference that becomes clear. Because guess what? It starts with self control here. Now, before anything else, a man has to be able to regulate himself, not in ideal conditions, but, not even when everything is aligned, but when it's not, right? When something doesn't go the way they want or doesn't land the way they expect, when there's tension, when there's uncertainty, if he can't hold himself steady in those moments, then whatever he's trying to hold outside of himself is already unstable. And this happened to me yesterday. I'm being very clear. I'm going to use myself as an example. I wrote a status message on social media, and I'm very clear about this point. BDSM is not therapy. It's not a modality, right? And this upset a lot of people, but I didn't, through the attacks, through the slander, through the misrepresentations, I didn't lose control. I stayed regulated. I focused on the core argument. I stick with the facts. I stick with what's known. All of these things, right? This is how we have to learn to steady ourselves. I didn't come to doing this because I magically did this. It's taken time to learn to do these things, right? I'm going to get to all that later too, because quite a bit I need to expand on why. I think some people don't even understand why I just kind of made this. It's not the first time I've said this comment either, and it's not going to be the last, right? But let's get back on track here. Self control comes first, or nothing else holds in their life. From there, it moves to emotional regulation under pressure. Now, it's easy to appear steady when things are smooth. And that's not going to really tell you a whole lot. The real information shows up when there's a lot of friction, disagreement, delay, misalignment, something that disrupts any part of the flow. Does he stay consistent in how he responds, or does everything tighten? Does he escalate? Does he shut down? Regulation is not the absence of reaction, it's the ability to stay in control of how you respond while something is happening. Without that, everything becomes reactive, and reactivity cannot hold power. Then there's consistency over time. This is where most people get it wrong, because they focus on the moments instead of the patterns. Anyone can hold a role for a short period of time. Anyone can present well in the beginning. That doesn't mean anything on its own. What matters is whether the same behavior shows up repeatedly across different situations without needing to be reinforced. Why? Because consistency removes the guesswork. If someone is stable, you don't have to keep recalibrating around them. You're not trying to figure out who you are getting from one moment to the next. It's already been shown to you, it's been proven. And that stability is what allows anything else to build on top of it. Then you get something most men fail at quickly: the ability to hear no without destabilizing. It's not about tolerance, it's about capacity. When someone says no, or they disagree, or they set a boundary, it introduces friction into that interaction. If that friction immediately creates a shift in tone or behavior or their presence, then there was no stability there to begin with. So, no, in this context, is where structure gets tested. So, if a man needs agreement to stay steady, then he's not in control of himself. He's dependent on the other person to maintain that state. And once that dependency is there, everything becomes conditional. That leads directly to the last point: no need to prove authority. When authority is real, it it does not need to be reinforced constantly. It doesn't need to be announced or defended or demonstrated in obvious ways. It shows up in how someone carries themselves, how they respond, or how consistent they are over time. The need to prove, right? It's usually the clearest sign that it's not actually there. Because if someone is secure in it, there's nothing to prove. There's nothing to defend. There's nothing to force. It holds all on its own. So when you put this all together, the definition becomes quite simple. Power is not what you take from someone else. It's what you can hold without collapsing when it's challenged, when it's questioned, and when it's definitely not being given to you easily. If you cannot hold in those moments, then it was never power to begin with. And this is where we get into performance, reality, and misplaced responsibility. This is where things start to settle. Because once you understand that what actually holds, you can start to see what people have been reacting to the entire time. Most people, you know, what they want to respond to is not power, it's the performance. That's what they're reacting to. So men copying behavior or language or posture, trying to look like they're in control without actually having it. And on the surface, that can be convincing, especially early. And it sounds right, it looks right, and it carries just enough structure, right, for it to pass as if nothing is being pushed against it. But it does not hold. And when it breaks, people don't always recognize it. What they're seeing, they don't need to see the lacks of structure underneath it. They see the reaction, the shift, that inconsistency. They respond to all of that without understanding where it's coming from. That's where the confusion starts. Because if you're reacting to the surface, everything here looks the same. The man who does not know what he is doing, the man who is compensating, the man who is acting with intent, all start to blend together. And guess what? The distinctions disappear. And once that happens, the response becomes broad instead of precise. And then confusion leads to blame. And that blame usually gets pushed in one direction. It becomes what the man did, how he showed up, what went wrong on that side. And while that does matter, it's not the full picture. Because dynamics, relationships, our interactions, they don't operate on one side. Poor communication exists on both sides. If something is not being said clearly, if expectations are assumed instead of defined, that creates a gap. And if those gaps get filled with interpretation, guess what? Then you're not going to have any accuracy, right? Unclear boundaries exist on both sides, not just whether someone respects them, but whether they're actually established in a way that can be understood and held. If a boundary is inconsistent, if the shifts, at all, depending on the moment, that creates instability inside of that interaction. This is my favorite one. Projection exists on both sides. People bring their own expectations, their own experiences, and they place them onto what's happening in front of them. They respond to what they think is there, not always what is actually being shown. So if you ignore that, you're not describing reality, you're describing and reacting to a surface level version of it. That doesn't mean responsibility is equal to every situation. It means that if you only look at one side, you're not actually understanding what happened. You're simplifying it to make it easier to process. And that simplification is what keeps the pattern going. Because if everything is reduced to one's cause, one side, or one explanation, what actually changes? Nothing. The same behaviors repeat, the same reactions follow, and the same confusion shows up time and time again. This is why separating performance from reality matters. Performance creates the illusion of control. It gives people something to react to, something to label, or even respond against. But if you stay at that level, you're never going to get to the structure underneath it. And without that, you can't respond accurately. So you're either overreacting to something that needed correction or you miss something that required a stronger response. So what ends up happening is a loop. Performance creates confusion, confusion leads to blame, and blame leads to, replaces understanding. And when that is actually needed, especially the clarity around the structure or the behavior, right? Or even what holds over time. As we wind this down today, this is where it all settles. There is a difference between talking about power and carrying it. Most people stay around the idea of it, right? The language or the appearance or the reaction it creates. Very few actually sit with what it requires over time because it's not convenient. It costs consistency when it would be easier just to react, or restraint when it would be easier to push, and patience when things aren't moving the way you want them to. Most of that happens without recognition, right? Without reinforcement and without anyone pointing it out. And that's where most people drop it. Not because they cannot do it all at once, but because they can't sustain it when something stops giving them, something back. This is not about shaming men out of power. It's about being clear on what it asks you if you decide to step into it. If you're not willing to hold yourself to that standard, then what are you calling power is actually something else. And that's fine as long as you're honest about it. But if you're going to carry it, it has to hold when it's quiet, when it gets challenged, when there's nothing there to reinforce it. The men who understand that don't need to explain it or argue for it or prove it. It just shows up in how they are and it stays there. So here's the question I'm going to leave you with this week, right? And I want you to sit with this because it's important. Does what you call power still hold when it's tested? That's a big one. All right, I want to get to a couple of things because this episode kind of coincides to some things I've been dealing with, or actually dealing with is the wrong word. Some things I've been observing, especially on social media. So, over the last few weeks, there's been somebody I've been quietly, who's coming into my radar. It wasn't intentional. It started a few weeks ago with them writing a piece that basically said dominants are required to do X, Y, and Z. Doesn't matter. I wrote a counter piece to that because it's illogical what they were saying. You're putting all the responsibility on one person. The escalation of this language has continued, that this person is now overlapping psychological language to make inferences that somehow BDSM is a regulation tool. It's a psychological healing premise. None of this is true. The things that this person is saying are gross misrepresentations. So much so, when I challenge this person's authority, when I challenged them in their space, when I made them uncomfortable with facts, they didn't respond. They deleted my comment. So much so now that when I'm reading new articles that they're producing, they are begging for more people to follow to reinforce their nature, to feel seen, right? Because they can't hold anything that challenges it, which goes directly to what I'm saying today. And yes, I'm speaking about a man. I've since blocked this person because it's easier for me. I also think that they're doing something else, but that's part of the reason. But the reality is, this goes exactly what I'm saying. So, on that note, please be careful when you're got somebody who's trying to wield you off site for their workshops and educational forums. They're using this language because I've talked about this in the past to get you to pay them for a workshop on BDSM, and then they're encouraging you to talk about your emotions and they're not qualified to do it. Don't do that. If you do, buyer beware. That's all I'm going to say. But all of this spurred and came up yesterday, came to a head because this person started simply saying, to the extent that somehow BDSM is going to be a type of therapy. It's not. It's not a regular. They stated it was a regulatory tool. It's not. They made the false equivalency that it's going to heal trauma. It does not. And I said this on my status. And I'm going to read this I'm very clear about this point because it's not going to change. And unfortunately, no matter how much we can find some therapeutic release in it, just like we can in cooking or running or working out, BDSM is not therapy. It's not a modality. I'm not here to argue this point. You can look up the research on your own. The people that are making false equivalencies, it doesn't hold, right? BDSM isn't therapy. It's not a regulatory tool. It doesn't heal trauma. Things can feel intense, right? Or they can feel relieving inside of your dynamic, but that doesn't mean something deeper is being processed or resolved. And people need to stop pushing this as if it's doing psychological work that is not designed to do. And people like this person I'm talking about are putting people in harm's way. So beware. If you're not and you want to believe it, go ahead. The problem that I'm seeing is that people bring this into a setting where we're discussing it, and you have to take that notion out because it's unhelpful. Right? Now, this this conversation today then leads me to how I held myself. I battled, I don't know, 300 plus comments. Not all of them I had to address. Some were outright attacks telling me I'm wrong. I didn't change. I didn't call people names. People started insulting me. People started attacking because their arguments fell apart. I held steady. Not because I think I'm better, but it's just I held my point. I based it on facts. I got insults, and today in my AMA, I had somebody who was extremely vile. It was extremely disgusting, right? Telling me I don't belong in kink. I've been in first off, I'm not in kink. I'm in BDSM lifestyle. And I've been a part of the lifestyle for 27 years, serving this community, giving back to this community. And let me make this very clear. Yes, I worked in law enforcement, and yes, I served in the military, and yes, I served the United States in other capacities. I will never apologize for that. If you don't like me for that, because you don't like certain types of jobs, that's fine. I'm not asking you to be here. But I did that with distinction. I did it with pride. I now help these people in my current role, day in and day out, because I love doing it. And I'm not going to apologize for it. So if you don't like me for that, that's fine. Insulting me and calling me names isn't going to change how I feel. It does show me where the lack of control and people's power and positions are. I only answered that AMA because I want to show people this is what I deal with. Just because I'm proud of something I did. The world's a different place. I've been telling you for weeks now, do random acts of kindness, because this is the stuff that keeps fueling division. Now, I didn't bring this up to fuel division. That person's opinion is their own. I'm not here to change it. It's not going to change mine. I will continue to do what I do, to give worksheets to our community, to write so you all can feel seen, and to talk about things that are uncomfortable so we can get through them and you can understand yourself maybe a little bit better. If that's a problem, if you don't like how I deliver it, there are plenty of other podcasts. None that I really know do what I do. There are some grifters out there attempting to do it. That's fine. Go to them. You're welcome here. I'd like you to be here, even if you disagree. I've offered people that I'm going to tell you right now, the show on politics and psychology is coming. I've been offering this for weeks. Anybody who wants to talk to me about it, if you want to take one side or the other, we can. And I'm going to do race play. I'm not going to back away from these. For years, I didn't want to touch them because it would be controversial. But if we can't discuss things rationally and have a conversation, just because you disagree with an opinion and your opinion is the only one that counts, then the very world you want to change to make what somebody says better is not better. It's groupthink. And groupthink destroys individuality. It destroys creation. It destroys people who want to be innovative because nothing outside of what that group think is allowed. Right? Little off topic, but it's all kind of sus together. What am I going to do this week for I don't know yet. It's raining where I'm at currently. It's going to be sunny by this weekend to the other places I'm going. I travel a lot. Told you all this before. However, with that being said, I don't know what I'm going to do. Maybe something is going to present itself to me. I'm going to try. Each week, one thing, right? Random act of kindness. Me even suggesting a random act of kindness is a way to keep the world going better. Even if we don't like it, we sit in these uncomfortable truths, right? All right, that's enough of all that. I'm going to let it. We're going to move on. I'm going to bring us back to the question for today. The question I want you to sit with is, does what you call power still hold when it's tested? I want you all to think about that one. It's a little bit deep, but it's very relevant. Let's keep these conversations going. Hit me up on the socials. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay king.